Most men believe that the way to keep a woman's attention is to give her more of their attention, more messages, more explanations, more reassurance, more availability. They believe that if they disappear for even a moment, she will forget them. So they chase, they text again when she does not respond. They explain themselves when she becomes distant. They try to fix every change in her mood. They become increasingly available, hoping that more attention will somehow create more attraction. But human psychology often works in the opposite direction. The more predictable your presence becomes, the easier it becomes to take that presence for granted. And this is where the psychology of silence begins. Not as a cheap trick, not as a manipulation tactic, and certainly not as a childish attempt to punish someone. The real power of ignoring a woman begins when you understand something most men never learn: your attention only has value when you are capable of withholding it. Because when someone knows they can access you whenever they want, your attention slowly becomes ordinary, expected, guaranteed. And anything that becomes guaranteed eventually loses some of its impact. Think about a man who responds instantly to every message. She sends something. He answers. She disappears. He sends another message. She becomes distant. He asks what is wrong. She gives him less attention. He gives her more. Without realizing it, he is communicating something extremely powerful. His attention is always available. His emotional state depends on her reaction. His priorities can be interrupted whenever she wants, and eventually she no longer experiences his attention as something valuable. She experiences it as something normal. Now, imagine a completely different man. He cares about her. He enjoys talking to her. He wants the connection. But his entire life does not revolve around maintaining her attention. He has goals. He has responsibilities. He has standards. He has a life that continues moving whether she responds or not. When he gives attention, he gives it intentionally. When he becomes quiet, he is not desperately trying to create a reaction. He is simply not abandoning his own life for someone else's approval. And that difference changes everything, because attention becomes meaningful when it is given by choice rather than need. Human beings naturally notice changes. They notice when someone who was always available becomes less available. They notice when someone who constantly explained himself suddenly becomes quiet. They notice when someone who always chased suddenly stops chasing. And the moment something changes, the mind begins asking questions. What happened? Why is he different? Did something change? Where is his attention now? And once questions appear, curiosity begins. This is one of the most powerful principles in human psychology. People rarely spend much time thinking about what they completely understand. They think about what they cannot completely predict. They think about what has changed. They think about what feels uncertain. They think about what they can no longer take for granted. This is why silence can create such a powerful psychological effect. Not because silence magically makes someone fall in love with you, but because silence creates space, and the human mind naturally fills empty space with thought. When you constantly explain yourself, there is nothing left to discover. When you constantly reveal what you are thinking, there's nothing left to wonder about. When you constantly tell someone where you are, what you are doing, what you are feeling, and why you are feeling it, you remove uncertainty. Everything becomes predictable, and predictability creates comfort. But too much comfort can destroy awareness. Think about what happens when a person hears the same sound every day. Eventually, they stop noticing it. The sound is still there, but their mind has adapted to it. The same thing can happen with attention. When your attention is endless, it becomes part of the background. But when your attention becomes intentional, people notice it differently. This is why emotional control matters. The average man reacts. She takes longer to respond, and he becomes anxious. She changes her tone, and he becomes defensive. She seems distant, and he starts demanding explanations. She does not give him the reassurance he wants, and he begins trying harder. Every emotion produces an immediate reaction. And because he reacts so quickly, he gives away something far more valuable than attention. He gives away control, because emotional control does not mean you stop feeling. It means you stop allowing every feeling to control your behavior. You can feel jealousy without acting jealous. You can feel uncertainty without begging for reassurance. You can feel disappointment without sending an emotional paragraph. You can feel the urge to chase without actually chasing. That small space between emotion and action is where power begins. Anyone can react. Anyone can send the angry message. Anyone can demand an explanation. Anyone can say, "Why are you ignoring me?" But remaining calm when your emotions are telling you to react requires discipline, and discipline changes how people perceive you. A person who is constantly emotionally reactive becomes predictable. Push a certain button and they react, create a little uncertainty, and they panic, withdraw attention, and they chase, give attention, and they become comfortable. But someone who remains centered is different. You cannot easily control their emotional state because they do not immediately surrender it to you. That is why silence is often misunderstood. Silence is not weakness. Silence is not fear, and silence is not necessarily rejection. Sometimes silence is simply the decision not to react until you understand what you are reacting to. This is where many men make their biggest mistake. They think they have to respond to everything. Every delay needs an explanation. Every change in behavior needs an investigation. Every uncomfortable emotion needs immediate reassurance. But emotionally mature people understand something different. Not every feeling requires action. Not every situation requires a response. Not every silence needs to be broken. Sometimes you need to step back long enough to see what is actually happening. Because when you react immediately, you are often responding to the emotion rather than the reality. And temporary emotions create permanent mistakes. A moment of insecurity can produce a message you regret. A moment of jealousy can destroy trust. A moment of fear can make you appear desperate. A moment of anger can reveal how easily you can be controlled. This is why emotional control is one of the rarest forms of power, not because it allows you to control another person, but because it prevents another person's behavior from controlling you. And once you understand this, the meaning of silence changes completely. You are no longer becoming quiet because you want her to chase you. You are becoming quiet because you refuse to chase validation. You are no longer withholding attention because you want to punish her. You are simply refusing to give attention from a place of desperation. There is a massive difference. One is manipulation, the other is self-respect. And people can feel that difference. When silence comes from insecurity, it feels like a game. When silence comes from self-control, it feels different. There is no performance, no hidden message, no desperate attempt to create jealousy. You simply continue living your life, and that is where something interesting happens. Your absence becomes noticeable without you trying to make it noticeable, because people often recognize value more clearly when they experience the difference between presence and absence. Think about someone who is always there. You speak to them every day. You know they will answer. You know they will check on you. You know they will make the effort. Eventually, the mind adapts. But when that pattern changes, naturally, awareness returns. Suddenly, what was invisible becomes visible. The person begins remembering your presence. They remember your conversations. They remember your attention. They remember the things they previously took for granted. This is not because absence creates value out of nothing. It reveals value that familiarity may have hidden. And this is why one of the greatest mistakes a man can make is trying too hard to remain present in a woman's mind. He messages constantly because he is afraid of being forgotten. He checks constantly because he is afraid of losing her. He explains constantly because he is afraid of being misunderstood. But the more desperately he tries to remain present, the more he reveals that his own peace depends on her attention. And that is where attraction, respect, and self-respect can begin to collapse. Because your life should not become a negotiation for someone else's attention. Your purpose should not disappear because someone becomes distant. Your goals should not be abandoned because someone stops responding. Your emotional stability should not rise and fall based on someone else's mood. You can care deeply about someone without making them the center of your existence. That is emotional independence. And emotional independence is far more powerful than any psychological trick. Because once you stop needing someone to respond a certain way, you become free to observe reality. You can finally ask better questions. Is this person actually interested? Are they respecting me? Is the relationship balanced? Am I being valued, or am I simply chasing something that is not being reciprocated? When you are desperate for an outcome, you cannot see clearly. You interpret every small signal according to what you hope is true. A delayed message becomes a disaster. A short response becomes rejection. A moment of distance becomes a reason to chase harder. But when you regain emotional control, you stop interpreting everything emotionally. You observe, you wait, you allow behavior to reveal the truth. And this is where silence becomes powerful for another reason. It gives you information. When you stop forcing the interaction, you get to see what happens naturally. Does she reach out? Does she show interest? Does she make an effort? Does she notice your absence, or does nothing change? That answer can tell you more than 100 emotional conversations, because you cannot force genuine interest. You cannot negotiate attraction. You cannot convince someone to value you through endless explanations. And you cannot create respect by begging for it. Respect becomes stronger when you respect yourself first. This is why self-respect is more important than being desired. Most men want to know how to make a woman miss them. But a better question is, why are you so afraid that she might not? That question changes everything, because underneath the desire to make someone miss you is often a deeper fear, the fear of being forgotten, the fear of being replaced, the fear of not being enough, the fear that if you stop trying, she will leave. And when fear controls your behavior, you become easy to manipulate, not necessarily because the other person is intentionally manipulating you, but because your emotional state is now dependent on their behavior. They respond and you feel valuable. They disappear and you feel worthless. They show affection and you feel confident. They become distant and your confidence collapses. That is not emotional strength. That is emotional dependence. Your value cannot be allowed to rise and fall according to another person's attention. Because if someone can determine your confidence simply by choosing whether to text you back, they have been given control over something that belongs to you. Your peace, your self-worth, your emotional stability, and this is where the deeper lesson of silence appears. The real purpose of silence is not to make someone think about you. It is to stop thinking that your worth depends on whether they do. That is the transformation. At first, you think silence is about her. Then you realize it is about you. You thought you were learning how to make someone miss you, but you were actually learning how to stop abandoning yourself. You thought you were learning how to create mystery, but you were actually learning how to become comfortable without constant reassurance. You thought you were learning how to control another person's emotions, but you were actually learning how to control your own reactions. And that is a much deeper form of power, because you cannot control whether someone stays. You cannot control whether someone chooses you. You cannot control whether someone loses interest. You cannot control what another person feels, but you can control what you do with those feelings. You can control whether you chase. You can control whether you beg. You can control whether you abandon your standards. You can control whether you allow rejection to destroy your identity. And that is where true emotional freedom begins. Emotionally strong people are not people who never feel pain. They feel disappointment. They feel attraction. They feel jealousy. They feel uncertainty. They feel loss. The difference is that they do not become prisoners of those emotions. They experience them without allowing them to dictate every decision. That is self-command. And self-command is one of the greatest forms of power a person can develop, because the world is full of people trying to control each other, trying to get attention, trying to get approval, trying to create jealousy, trying to provoke reactions, trying to make someone chase. But the person who truly understands psychology eventually realizes something uncomfortable. The easiest person to control is the person who cannot control himself. If you know exactly what reaction will make someone chase you, you can influence them. If you know exactly what silence will make them panic, you can influence them. If you know exactly what words will trigger their insecurity, you can influence them. But if you develop emotional discipline, those triggers lose their power over you. You become harder to manipulate because you no longer react automatically. And this is why the art of silence is ultimately not about ignoring a woman. It is about becoming the kind of man who does not need to chase anyone for proof of his worth. A man with purpose does not disappear to create a reaction. He simply has somewhere to go. A man with self-respect does not withhold attention to punish someone. He simply does not give unlimited access to people who do not value it. A man with emotional control does not remain silent because he is afraid to speak. He remains silent because he understands that not every emotion deserves a voice, and when he finally speaks, his words carry more weight because they are not coming from panic, they are coming from choice. This is the paradox most people never understand. The moment you stop trying to make someone value you is often the moment you begin acting like someone already values himself. You stop over-explaining, you stop chasing, you stop seeking constant reassurance, you stop measuring your worth through another person's attention, you stop asking, how do I make her miss me? And you start asking a much more powerful question, am I living a life I would still respect if she were not in it? That question separates emotional dependence from emotional strength because the strongest position is not making someone afraid of losing you. The strongest position is becoming so grounded in yourself that you are no longer afraid of losing someone who does not value you. That is the real art of silence. Not manipulation, not pretending not to care, self-control, self-respect, emotional independence. Because when your peace no longer depends on another person's attention, they can no longer easily control your emotions. When your confidence no longer depends on another person's approval, rejection loses its power over you. And when your self-worth no longer depends on another person's presence, you finally become free. At that point, silence is no longer a strategy. It becomes a reflection of who you are. You do not need to chase. You do not need to prove. You do not need to explain every emotion. You do not need to convince anyone of your value. You simply continue moving forward. And whether someone chooses to walk beside you or walk away, your direction remains the same because the ultimate power was never in making her miss you. It was in becoming a man who no longer needs anyone to miss him in order to know his own worth. That is the real psychology of silence. And that is where emotional control becomes true power. There is a moment when silence stops being something you do and becomes something people feel. It happens when your behavior no longer comes from the need to get a reaction. You are not becoming quiet because you want her to wonder where you are. You are not pulling away because you want her to chase. You are not withholding attention because you want to punish her. You simply stop allowing another person's behavior to determine your behavior. And that is when silence becomes powerful because people can sense the difference between someone who is pretending not to care and someone who genuinely does not need constant reassurance. The first person is still emotionally attached to the outcome. The second person is attached to his own standards. And human beings respond very differently to those two energies. Think about the man who says he does not care, but checks his phone every 30 seconds. He says he is ignoring her, but watches whether she is online. He tells himself he has moved on, but becomes anxious when she does not reach out. That is not silence. That is emotional dependence disguised as silence. True silence begins when you can put your phone down without wondering whether she noticed. It begins when you can continue your day without checking for a reaction. It begins when her behavior stops becoming the center of your attention. And this is where most people misunderstand emotional control. They think control means controlling the situation, but real control means controlling yourself inside the situation. You cannot control what she thinks. You cannot control what she feels. You cannot control whether she misses you. You cannot control whether she reaches out, but you can control whether you spend your entire day waiting for her to do it. That distinction changes everything because the moment you stop waiting for a particular outcome, your behavior becomes calmer, and calmness creates clarity. When you are emotionally attached to an outcome, you interpret everything through that outcome. A message becomes a sign, a delayed response becomes a warning, a like becomes hope, a missed call becomes anxiety. You start looking for hidden meanings in ordinary behavior because your mind desperately wants certainty. But certainty is often impossible, and the more you demand certainty from another person, the more powerless you become. Emotionally strong people learn to tolerate uncertainty. They do not need to know what someone is thinking every second. They do not need immediate reassurance. They do not need to decode every change in tone. They observe patterns instead of obsessing over individual moments, because one message can be misleading. One day can be misleading, one emotional reaction can be misleading, but consistent behavior tells a much clearer story. This is why silence can be useful. It removes your interference. When you stop constantly pushing the interaction forward, you get to see what naturally comes back toward you. If she is interested, you may see effort. If she values the connection, you may see initiative. If she wants distance, you may see that too. And either way, you receive information. You no longer have to create an answer. You simply observe it. This is a powerful shift because desperate people try to create the outcome they want. Strong people allow reality to reveal itself. They do not force. They do not beg. They do not negotiate for affection. They do not try to convince someone to care. They watch, and watching requires patience. Patience is difficult because the human mind hates uncertainty. When you do not know what someone is thinking, your imagination begins creating explanations. Maybe she is losing interest. Maybe she met someone else. Maybe she is testing me. Maybe I should send another message. Maybe I should explain. Maybe I should disappear completely. The mind keeps producing possibilities, and every possibility creates another emotional reaction. This is how people lose control without realizing it, not because something actually happened, but because they reacted to what they imagined might happen. The emotionally disciplined person creates distance between reality and imagination. He asks one simple question: what do I actually know? What do I fear? Not what do I hope? Not what story am I creating? What do I actually know? That question can save you from countless emotional mistakes. Because when you know less than you think you know, silence becomes wiser than reaction. Sometimes you do not need another message. You need more information. Sometimes you do not need another explanation. You need more observation. Sometimes you do not need to chase clarity from another person. You need clarity within yourself. And this leads to another psychological principle. People often reveal more when you stop trying to make them reveal something. When you constantly question someone, they can give you answers designed to end the conversation. But when you become quiet, behavior has more room to speak. Actions become visible. Effort becomes visible. Consistency becomes visible. Interest becomes visible. Disinterest becomes visible. And this is why emotional control gives you something that chasing never can. It gives you perspective. You begin seeing the relationship as it actually is rather than as you desperately want it to be. That is uncomfortable. But discomfort often contains truth. A man who cannot tolerate discomfort will chase reassurance. A man who can tolerate discomfort can wait long enough to discover reality. And waiting is not weakness. Sometimes waiting is discipline. Sometimes doing nothing is more powerful than doing the wrong thing, because every unnecessary action creates another opportunity to lose your position. One emotional message can undo weeks of composure. One desperate explanation can reveal insecurity. One attempt to force attention can destroy the mystery you were trying to create. But there is an even deeper lesson. You should not become silent simply to increase your value in someone's eyes. You should become disciplined enough that your value does not depend on how someone sees you. That is the difference between external power and internal power. External power asks, how can I make her react? Internal power asks, why does her reaction have so much control over me? The second question is far more important, because if you need someone to chase you before you feel valuable, you are still dependent on them. If you need someone to miss you before you feel important, you are still dependent on them. If you need someone to fear losing you before you feel secure, you are still dependent on them. You may have changed your behavior, but you have not changed your psychology, and psychology is where real transformation happens. The goal is not to become emotionally cold, it is to become emotionally stable. There is a difference. Coldness says, I do not care about anyone. Stability says, I care, but I will not abandon myself. Coldness builds walls. Stability builds boundaries. Coldness avoids vulnerability. The stability accepts vulnerability without becoming dependent on it. This is why the strongest man is not necessarily the man who feels nothing. He may feel deeply. He may care deeply. He may become attached. But he does not allow attachment to destroy his judgment. He can love someone without worshiping them. He can miss someone without chasing them. He can desire someone without needing them. And that balance creates a completely different kind of presence because neediness and desire are not the same thing. Neediness says, I need you to make me feel complete. Desire says, I want you in my life, but my life still exists without you. That distinction is enormous. The first gives another person responsibility for your emotional state. The second keeps responsibility where it belongs, with you. And once you understand that, silence becomes much easier. You do not need to force yourself not to text. You simply stop feeling that you must text. You do not need to pretend you are busy. You actually have things worth doing. You do not need to manufacture mystery. Your life naturally contains things that do not revolve around another person. This is why purpose is so important. A man without purpose has too much emotional space available for one person. Every message becomes important. Every interaction becomes important. Every small change becomes important. But a man with purpose has somewhere else to place his attention. His work matters. His health matters. His ambitions matter. His friendships matter. His personal growth matters. His future matters. The relationship can be important without becoming everything. And paradoxically, that often makes the relationship healthier. Because when two people have their own lives, they meet from a position of choice rather than dependence. You are not together because you cannot survive separately. You are together because you genuinely choose each other. That is a much stronger foundation. And this is where the psychology of absence becomes deeper. Absence is powerful only when presence has meaning. If you disappear because you are playing a game, your absence is simply manipulation. But if you step back because you are living your life, your absence becomes natural. You are not trying to create scarcity. You are simply not giving unlimited access to your attention. There is a psychological difference between withholding and having boundaries. Withholding says, I will remove my attention so you suffer. A boundary says, I will not continue giving energy where there is no respect or reciprocity. One is punishment. The other is self-respect. And self-respect has a very different effect. It changes the way you carry yourself. You stop negotiating with people who repeatedly disrespect you. You stop explaining boundaries that have already been ignored. You stop trying to convince someone to see your value. You stop begging someone to give you what they willingly give to others. You begin understanding that not every connection deserves unlimited access to you. And once you understand that, you become much more selective. Not arrogant. Selective. There is a difference. Arrogance says, I am better than everyone. Self-respect says, I know what I will and will not accept. That standard changes relationships because people learn how to treat you partly through what you tolerate. If you repeatedly accept inconsistency, inconsistency becomes normal. If you repeatedly chase after someone who withdraws, withdrawal becomes a way to control your attention. If every time someone pulls away, you run toward them, you teach them that distance produces pursuit. But when you remain calm, you interrupt that pattern. You are not punishing them. You are simply refusing to participate in the cycle. And once the cycle breaks, something becomes visible, the truth. Maybe the person comes closer, maybe they make an effort, maybe they do not. Either outcome is useful. Because your goal should not be to force the person to choose you. Your goal should be to discover whether they already choose you. That is a completely different mindset. The first mindset is chasing. The second is observing. The first asks, how do I make this work? The second asks, does this actually work? The first ignores reality for the sake of hope. The second respects reality even when it hurts. And emotional maturity requires the second, because sometimes the strongest form of silence is accepting an answer you did not want. Maybe she does not reach out. Maybe she does not miss you. Maybe the connection was never as deep as you believed. That can hurt. But pain is not the same as defeat. Rejection is not proof that you are worthless. Someone choosing another direction does not reduce your value. Someone losing interest does not make you less of a man. Someone leaving does not mean you failed. It means the connection reached a point where two people wanted different things. And emotionally strong people can accept that without destroying themselves. They grieve, they learn, they continue, they do not turn rejection into an obsession. They do not spend months trying to reverse a decision someone else already made. They do not make another person's choice the definition of their identity. This is one of the hardest lessons in human psychology, and you cannot make everyone choose you, and you do not need to. Your goal is not to become irresistible to everyone. Your goal is to become so grounded that rejection no longer makes you betray yourself. That is real confidence. Confidence is not believing everyone wants you. Confidence is knowing you will be okay if someone does not. That is why silence can become transformative. At first, you use silence to change someone's attention. Then you use silence to control your reactions. Then you realize you no longer need the reaction, and eventually silence becomes peace. You stop checking, you stop wondering, you stop calculating, you stop trying to predict, you stop asking whether she noticed. You simply live, and that is when you become difficult to manipulate. Two, because manipulation depends on predictable emotional reactions. If someone knows exactly what will make you panic, they have leverage. If someone knows exactly what will make you chase, they have leverage. If someone knows exactly what will make you abandon your standards, they have leverage. But when you become emotionally disciplined, those levers stop working. You still feel, but you choose. You still care, but you remain grounded. You still desire, but you do not become desperate. And that is the difference between having emotions and being controlled by emotions. Most people spend their lives trying to control circumstances. They want the perfect relationship, the perfect response, the perfect amount of attention, the perfect outcome. But life does not give anyone that kind of certainty. People change, feelings change, relationships change, circumstances change. The only thing you can consistently control is your response. And once you accept that, you stop wasting energy on battles you cannot win. You cannot control whether she misses you, but you can control whether you miss her so much that you abandon yourself. You cannot control whether she reaches out, but you can control whether you spend your day waiting. You cannot control whether she chooses you, but you can control whether you continue choosing yourself. That is the deepest lesson, because the ultimate goal of emotional control is not to become someone who can manipulate others. It is to become someone who cannot easily be manipulated by his own insecurity. And once you reach that level, your silence changes. It is no longer a weapon. It is no longer a tactic. It is no longer a test. It becomes a natural consequence of self-respect. You do not speak because you are afraid. You speak when there is something worth saying. You do not chase because you are incapable of being alone. You move toward people who move toward you. You do not disappear to create fear. You create a life so full of purpose that you no longer need to manufacture absence. And perhaps that is the greatest paradox of all. The more desperate you become to make someone miss you, the more dependent you become on their reaction. But the moment you become genuinely comfortable with your own presence, whether they miss you or not, stops being the most important question. You stop asking, how do I make her think about me? And you begin asking, why am I thinking about her this much? You stop asking, how do I make her chase? And you begin asking, why am I chasing someone who is not moving toward me? You stop asking, how do I make her afraid of losing me? And you begin asking, why am I afraid of losing someone who may not value me? Those questions are uncomfortable, but they are powerful because they return control to the only place where it truly belongs, within yourself. And when you reclaim that control, something changes. You become calmer, you become more patient, you become more selective, you become less reactive. You stop needing every interaction to prove something about your worth. And that is when your presence becomes stronger, not because you learned how to make someone miss you, but because you learned how to stop needing to be missed. That is the real art of silence. Not disappearing, not punishing, not manipulating, mastering yourself. Because the man who can walk away from his phone, return to his purpose, control his emotions, respect his standards, and accept whatever reality reveals is far more powerful than the man who knows 100 tricks for making someone chase him. The first man controls himself. The second is still trying to control someone else. And in the end, The deepest form of power has never been controlling another person's attention. It has always been becoming so emotionally independent that another person's attention is no longer capable of controlling you.